Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Lependorf, Executive Director of the John Cage Trust. Here we are in the John Cage Trust on the beautiful campus of Bard College. Um, these Chance Encounters have become a monthly series where we ask questions like Cage and accept all the answers we get like Cage as well. We don't know what will happen. It's an indeterminate space. I'm so thrilled, really, today to particularly to welcome James Pritchett, who was really one of the first musicologists to deal with John Cage's music on its own terms as music. His research presented the first clear documentation of Cage's chance operations of the 1950s and provided a model for the analytical study of his work. He's, of course, and many of you will know, the author of, hopefully you can see this, The Music of John Cage, indispensable book, the only critical study of all of Cage's work. If you want to know how Cage's music really works, this is the book. He's also written on the work of Morton Feldman, pianist composer David Tudor, and I'm happy to read this. He's married to the wonderful composer Frances White, and they've collaborated together on a variety of works. He designed and built the software for her interactive installation Resonant Landscape, and he created the text and video for her instrumental theater trilogy, The Old Rose Reader, As Night Falls, and The Book of Roses in Memory. And you can read more of James's work on his musicofjohncage.org website. Welcome, James Pritchett.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I'm glad to be here.
So, by way of getting going, before we get into the lecture on nothing, which is our topic for today, and I should say, for those of you lucky enough to be in upstate New York, this Saturday at 1 p.m. At Stevenson Library, the main library on Bard College campus, there will be many road signs around Bard. So, if you can find Bard, you'll be able to find where the performance is. We have a remarkable exhibition opening with a grand event at 1 p.m. The exhibition actually opens at noon. And it's called Cage Circle. It's a riff on Museum Circle, something that Cage did back in 1991 in Munich, where 19 museums that surrounded the Pinakothek Moderna in Munich were invited to provide lists of 10 representative items which could be loaned. Cage then used chance procedures to select one item from each museum, and that became the exhibition. So we've done our own riff on it. We've identified, including the John Cage Trust, 22 collections around here, and we received lists of around 15 items from each. And we selected some three or four items from each using chance. We did this publicly several weeks ago, and we've been installing this week. It's an amazing exhibition. Everything from Cage's own collection of preparations for the prepared piano to Hannah Arendt's kitchen cabinet door. So, and everything in between. So it's that alone is quite wonderful. And at 1 p.m., we'll be doing an immersive performance of the lecture on nothing. We subjected the lecture to chance procedures, every phrase, and there'll be three readers around the audience performing it. And in three corners of the space, in the fourth corner will be a later work by Cage, sometimes called 4/3, sometimes called Beach Birds, and we're calling it another alternate title, Extended Lullaby. And James, this will be a nice segue. When we get to the famous or infamous part four of the lecture on nothing, it will be clear why I've selected Extended Lullaby for that section. So those of you who know the piece very, very well will be giggling away right now, I think. So James, by way of getting going, let me ask you what I ask a lot of guests in this series. What is it that first brought you to the work of John Cage?
Well, Jeffrey, it's actually you were mentioning Frances earlier, and it was her. It's all her fault. When we were both undergraduates in music school at the University of Maryland, and she was studying composition, and I was studying piano. And I wanted to impress her as a composer because, I had designs on her, right? So I bought her for a birthday present. I bought her a copy of the book Silence. But I had ulterior motives, like I'm sure many people do. When you buy books for people, it's because you want to borrow them back. So I bought her a copy of Silence, and then I borrowed it and read it, and I was just so blown away by the book and the writing. And I wasn't sure I agreed with all of what he said, but it was just so brilliant and so entertaining that I then wanted to read more, and I spent a lot of time in the library and reading about the things that Cage read about and listening to the music and playing it, and it just sort of, ballooned from there.
Fantastic. I have to say that that is the book that was the gateway drug for so many, including me too. I was given it as a gift in high school, and probably didn't understand half of it at that point, but it was so unlike anything I'd ever read.
Right. Yeah,
And I
exactly.
just loved it. Just absolutely loved it. And of course, the lecture on nothing appears in silence. I have to say, I heartily approve of the one for you, one for me school of gift giving, especially when it's the same gift. I think that's it's a great model. Um, so let's jump to the lecture on nothing, if
Sure.
we can. So the book Silence was published in 61, but the lecture on nothing was written some 10 years earlier. Um, it's hard to, maybe you can say why we don't know exactly
Yeah.
when it was written, but when it
Well,
probably was.
yeah, he says that he wrote it in 1949 or 1950. He gives different dates, so it's not clear there. And we don't have a program book from its first, performance saying, yeah, but here's what it is. We do know from content inside the book, and I have to do a hat tip to Rob Haskins for this because he ran down all this stuff. There's a mention in the lecture of a conference that Cage went to, and we know that that conference was a conference at Sweetbriar College, I believe, that was in March of 1950. So the lecture could not have been written before that. It would have been sometime after. I always say it's like mid 1950, just based on the content and some other clues. And there's a number of other reasons. So I say 1950.
Yeah, that works for me. But the point is, it's much earlier than
Yeah,
Silence. And it
right,
was first performed publicly in 1950 at Robert Motherwell's uh, 8th Street Arts Club. And we'll say a
right.
little more about that later, I think. There's a funny little anecdote that not everyone may know. So let's get to the lecture. Mika, who's running tech for us, if you could bring up the first page of the lecture, as printed in the book Silence. We're going to get that on the screen in just a moment. And James, when we get up there, bef before we look at it closely, great, thank you. Um, what would you call this? I mean, is it a lecture? Is it a piece of music? It's explicitly a performance text, but how might we classify this thing?
Well, I think Cage himself said that he sort of realized that giving a lecture is a kind of performance. And this is lecture on nothing is actually one of the reasons it's such an important piece of Cage's work is it's the first lecture that he explicitly goes into it saying, I'm going to do this the way I make a piece of music. So he uses the same methods and approach that he would to writing a piece of music at that time in 1950. And really, I was thinking about it. Almost all of the lectures that he gives after this follow that same model. In some way or another, he's following his practices as a composer. There's a few exceptions, but there, for the most part, this is the model going forward.
Yeah, and I think we both agree this is a extraordinarily important milestone work for
Yeah,
Cage in many ways.
absolutely.
As a way of getting into it, we're going to hear Cage read part of it in a moment, but can I ask you to read the instructions up at the top?
Yeah, yeah. So this head note that he wrote, which was written in 1961 when it was getting ready for publication. So he says there are four, and he's describing the structure of it, of how he made this. So he says there's four measures in each line and 12 lines in each unit of the rhythmic structure. So there are 48 such units, each having 48 measures. The whole's divided into five large parts in proportions 7, 6, 14, 14, 7. And if you add those numbers together, they add up to 48. The 48 measures of each unit are likewise so divided. The text is printed in four columns to facilitate a rhythmic reading. Each line is to be read across the page left to right, not down in sequence in columns. This should not be done in an artificial manner, which might result from an attempt to be too strictly faithful to the position of the words on the page, but with the rubato, which you would use in everyday speech.
Right. So I'll just point out, I think everyone can see it. Maybe we can slide up just a bit to see the first two sections. If one were to count down 12 lines, you see a little symbol in the middle, little doodad in the middle of the line. So those are the 12 lines, and then we get another 12 lines before the next little symbol. So James, maybe you could let's sort of geek out on this. So maybe talk about what is that. So within the lecture itself, he talks about this micro macro structure, or what some of us call square root form. Actually, in the lecture, he says square root. It's also what there's a wonderful little book, hard to find these days, by Lou Harrison, A Primer for Composers, where he talks about Cage's square root form, which, according to Lou Harrison, exists in Korean court music. So
Interesting.
special. I
Yeah.
don't know if Cage knew that at the time, but I find that fascinating. Nothing new under the sun, as we say. But maybe talk about, even in these first little two sections, how does that 7, 6, 14, 14, how does that really, really work here? We know there
Yeah.
are 14 of these little symbols are going to happen. I
Yeah.
mean, 48 of them, rather.
Right. So the way in which he created this, gotta think the origin of this really comes from his work with dancers. So Cage is, above all else, he's a composer for dancers throughout his entire career. And so when you're writing music for dancers, typically you're concerned about phrase structure. What are their, that's the common thing between the two is how many beats, is this particular dance phrase going to be? And so you want to have something musically there. So this structure is really a phrase structure. He's got this number sequence, this proportion 7, 6, 14, 14, 7. Those are the lengths of phrases. And you can see right in the start, if you were, so you can see there's 4 columns there, and each one of those, if you think of as being a measure or a beat, if you count 7, you get the whole first sentence. I'm here and there's nothing to say, and then a silence. And then the if among you are those who wish to get somewhere, that's actually starting at the beginning of the second phrase, which goes for 6 of those beats. And then what we require is starting the third when it actually starts a little late into the phrase. This idea of phrase structure, just like in dance or in any kind of music, is very flexible, right? So you wouldn't want to have it be like every time it's just mechanically right on the phrase boundary. So he does that a little later. So that, because now this is a phrase of 14 beats, it's a longer phrase that then ends when you have the beginning of the next one of give anyone a thought, a push, and so forth. That's the start of the next 14. And then the last 7 beats starts with shall we have one later? And it goes to the end. And then now you've gone through 48 beats and you start
Right.
the cycle again. And he cycles through that same set of 5 different phrase lengths throughout the entire lecture.
So that's what I think a lot of folks don't really realize that those proportions, and I think I love that you say proportions because it really is about proportions, not counting. That these
Yeah,
proportions are on that small level of these beats or measures, right, of these sentences, these phrases, and then
phrases.
you end up with 7 of those, 7 plus 6 plus 14 plus 14 plus 7, and then you do that
Right.
again, right? So that you can count the 7, 6, 14, 14, 7 multiple times if you're counting small or counting larger or counting larger, right?
Yeah, yeah. So you have this, I think of it as a set of phrases, and you go through that cycle of phrases, of 5 phrases of that particular length, and then you get the little symbol, which I believe is the symbol for the astrological sign Virgo, which is
Yes, it is.
actually, which is Cage's sign, I believe. So that perhaps I have no idea if that drove that selection. I'm sure that was done by the person doing the typesetting. Anyway, you go through that cycle of 7 phrases, and you do it again. So that cycle is a unit of 48 measures, and you do the big structure of the piece where we think of sections of the lecture based on how many of these cycles are in each section. So there's a section of 7 of these cycles, there's a section of 6, slightly shorter, and then you have a much longer section of 14, and then another 14, and then you have a short section at the end of 7. So that's the overall large structure. So he thought of it as a way of relating phrase structure to overall big structure of the piece.
And I'll say for me, just conceptually, if we think of a more sort of westernized approach, the standard 4 plus 4, 8 plus 8, heightened, balanced phrases, those to me seem very complete. Whereas when you have this sort of logarithmic structure, the suggestion is that it could keep going. There's
Hmm.
something music of the spheres about it. You have those small level proportions, and we end up with this work, but somehow this nothing can continue
Yeah,
beyond the
yeah,
work, which is nice. Shall we hear Cage read a little bit?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it's a
So we're
great
going to
idea.
hear Cage read. What you're seeing on, we're going to end up scrolling one more line beyond this, but we're going to hear Cage read just the opening, and then it goes because of the proportions. It's going to go one line beyond what you're seeing right now, but we'll scroll up as he reads. So yeah, let's hear it.
I am here, and there is nothing to say. If among you are those who wish to get somewhere, let them leave at any moment. What we require is silence, but what silence requires is that I go on talking. Give any one thought a push. It falls down easily, but the pusher and the pushed produce that entertainment called a discussion. Shall we have one later? Or we could simply decide not to have a discussion, whatever you like. But now there are silences, and the words help make the silences. I have nothing to say, and I am saying it. And that is poetry as I need it. This space of time is organized. We need not fear these silences. We may love them.
And we'll stop there. As tempting as it would be to just enjoy the whole. Um, so there is so much going on in those first few lines. So I don't know. Maybe James, where would you like to dive in? There's just so much to unpack. We could spend hours on just the first few lines easily.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, so so I guess maybe so the first thing to note is just the delivery, which he does so beautifully, and this way that it's not some sort of mechanical thing. It's that he's speaking slowly with these pauses there, and often those pauses happen because he's waiting for the next phrase beginning to start. But it's a beautiful way of speaking. Um, and maybe a place to start. I'm not the expert on the art scene, but this audience for this was all of those New York artists, right, at Robert Motherwell's club. And I gotta think this was unlike anybody else's lecture to them. And in both in the manner of its delivery, but in this kind of low-key, self-effacing, not a big ego kind of thing. That was not that group, right? And I think he's deliberately doing it for that. It explains why there's some things in here that are downright aggravating for them, which we'll talk about at some point.
Yeah.
But even uh, it, it's kind of his way of undermining the sort of big man, ego-driven world of New York art at that time.
Yeah.
because what Cage is the subject of the lecture, he says is nothing, but it what he means by that is this kind of self denial, this sort of self-effacing, um, uh, not wanting to say anything, right? Not wanting to make a big statement.
And that's what's so wonderful about the line. Not only I have nothing to say and I'm saying it, the off quoted, but I think uh, I'm not looking at it, but the next line, I think what we require is silence. But what silence requires is that I go on talking, which at first might seem like a Zen koan, an impossibility. And throughout the lecture, and we hear it a lot in that, even that first bit, the statement of opposites that somehow
Mhm.
arrive at a truth, a very Zen
Yeah.
way of
Oh,
thinking about
absolutely.
things, right? That you need the two opposites to arrive at the truth in the middle, perhaps. But it's quite a literal line. The only way I can articulate silence is by speaking, so that
Right.
you know there's then silence. In the same way that later in 433, you need me to sit down at the piano and lift the lid or close it to know that the work has started, because I'm otherwise not doing anything. And in the same way, of course, that there's no such thing as silence. Perhaps here there's no such thing as nothing. Or what is
Well,
it?
I'd be careful about that one because the
Yeah.
silence that 4 minutes and 33 seconds is still a couple of years and a whole lot of events in his life in the future. And so when he's talking about silence here, he really doesn't have the same conception
No.
of it as that no such thing as silence. He really is thinking of silence and sound or speaking as opposites. And they're opposites. And you're right, this is such a Zen kind of thing. You got to have both of them, right? You got to have them to define each other. You can't just have one or the other. And that's what he's describing in this. But by the time he gets to 433, it's kind of he's risen above that to say, well, actually, there's just sound, right? There's no duality at all, and so that's kind of a different level of.
For me, the silence that we then experience, or maybe the point of this lecture, is not about sound, it's about presence.
Oh, it's about ego, and it's
Right.
about
Money.
grasping and what, am I going to insist upon a certain thing, and how do I think about things, right? He talks about sounds being sort of worn out by our thinking about them. So he's trying to have no thoughts. And in a very, I think, disingenuous way, it's just rhetorical. He says, "Oh, well, maybe there'll be an idea in this talk, or maybe there won't, or who, they no, there's lots of ideas in there." But
Well, it's
he's
also so funny that, it's the lecture on nothing, but it's not a lecture that's not about anything.
right, right, right.
It's very much about something. That something happens to be nothing, and then we have to imagine what that means.
Yeah, yeah,
They're actual profound thoughts. They're also little stories that,
yeah.
kind of
There's a
come
lot, there's a lot
fill up
that,
the
but
structure.
but he's very clear that the thing is about it's about music. So one thing I think that's important to realize about this is it's a composer's lecture. It's about music. It's not about philosophy and ideas, even though it has that in there and we talk about it a lot, but it's about music. So those 5 sections, he structures this on uh, explaining this model of music composition that he developed first in 1948, just a couple of years earlier. There are 4 components to composition: structure, form, material, and method. And he explains this as a lecture at Black Mountain College, where he first presents this in a very sort of polemical way, this defense of Sati lecture. And then he presents it in other writings before this. This lecture, same thing. So 4 of the 5 sections of the lecture are devoted to these things. The first section is about form, the second one's about structure, the third one's about material, and then there's the infamous fourth section, which is like a
What you
big
do. Yeah.
well, it's a big grand pause, really. It's this big desert in the middle of the lecture. And then the last section is about method.
Right.
So these are the things he's talking about. And he's um, particularly the section on material, he goes through a whole historical about his relationship to musical materials. So it's about those things. But what's really different about it is the language of it is so different from something like the what he had done before. It's much more poetic. It's much more personal. And it has this uh, he's what he's emphasizing about composing is not having any ideas, not trying to put something across, not trying to make a big statement. In the earlier lecture, he was contrasting Beethoven, who for him is like the poster child for making the big statement with the big ego, and Satie. And this is a lecture where he's doing the same thing, but he's doing it in a with much more poetic language and in a much less polemical kind of a way.
Also, what's one of the many wonderful things about it, as much as it is about certain things, it actually just is those things, right?
Right.
So it's not about how one might write a lecture like a piece of music. It is a lecture that is a piece of music or written as a piece of music.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so he frequently in the lecture, including the big fourth section, he describes the structural things. Here we are, we're at the first part of this, and now we're at the second part of that, and now we're starting that so that people can understand what's happening with that rhythmic structure. He describes it there.
So, of
Um,
course, earlier, he self-described as a percussion composer. That's really his earliest
mhm.
starting to be noticed. And I think maybe now would be a good time to bring in an earlier work that might shed a little light on the
Oh
structure.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So the string quartet. So uh and this I I know you're playing 4/3 with it there at Bard, but I've always thought that the companion piece to Lecture on Nothing is the string quartet in four parts. So which was written in 1949, 1950, a piece which he said he wanted in which he wanted to praise silence without actually using it, which is also like he might say praise nothing in in the terms of this lecture. But that piece, when he says, I'm writing this the way I write a piece of music, that's the one that he just finished. And that's one actually whose structure is not too dissimilar from this. It's one where the sections get longer and then you have a quick section at the end. And so, yeah, I think it's worth listening to the opening of the string quartet so that you have a sense of musically when he talks about musical continuity and how to be, I think he says here, disinterestedness, right? Attractively disinterested, what that means for him in 1950.
So we're going to hear just a little excerpt, the first minute of the opening of the string quartet.
There we go.
Great. It's so beautiful. I think people who don't know that work are so surprised that it's Cage, who only know the noisier works, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it comes from the period. So it's another reason that this lecture, that piece and this lecture are both really important, is they're happening right in the middle of this sea change in Cage's work. So this period between 1948 and 1952, there's just so much changing in his work. And it's where he's becoming the John Cage that we all know today, right? That he's famous for. So in 1948, he had just finished sonatas and interludes, kind of the masterpiece capstone of that prepared piano 1940s style that he was writing. And between there and 1952, where you have 4 minutes and 33 seconds and music of changes and all of the chance works that open up everything we know about Cage afterwards, that 4 years, a whole lot happens. And one of the things is the string quartet, which I won't get into the details about, but it's a really important piece compositionally for him working out musical problems. But yeah, it's like you can literally hum the tune, right? It's a single melody through the whole piece, and the phrases of that melody are conforming to the structure that we hear in the lecture on nothing. So when he's
Yeah.
writing this text to be read in that way, that's the speaking voice kind of is channeling that same vibe.
Yeah, I think we really do. I'm so glad you picked this excerpt because you really get the sense that if those string players were simply replacing each note with a word, it could be lecture on nothing.
It could be. There's not as much silence in it.
Of course. No, but
Yeah.
the idea of that it's proportional, also that as pretty as it is, it's not functional harmony.
No, well, that's the big innovation is that the way in which he uses harmony is totally non-functional. The melody is totally understandable, but the harmonies are
Yeah.
happening in a way accidentally, not really, kind of. I don't want to get into all of that. Read the
No,
book.
same. And I would say too that as much as there's always already this interest in non-hierarchy, um, you still see in the planning that the final sections are shorter. There's still a built-in kind of denouement,
Yeah,
even
yeah.
though the surface of the lecture on nothing or the string quartets is maybe flat, non-hierarchical, but there is still vestiges of a shape.
Oh
Of
yeah, no, for sure. The overall structure, the big structure is I think kind of carefully planned. It's, those two big sections in the lecture coming in after you have the sort of two in the two medium-ish ones and then these long ones. The big section on material, I think he devotes to that because this idea of material, and by material, Cage means sounds. What sounds are you making your music out of? That's becoming more and more his primary focus is on material. And so he's got a lot to say about it. And I think that's why he puts that in that prime position. And then the other one is the big desert, right? Which sort of goes nowhere.
So maybe let's talk a little bit about that fourth section. We'll go back, but
Yeah, yeah.
um, so when he performed it at Robert Motherwell's studio, I imagine this happened during the fourth section. We don't really know, but the artist Jean Reynal stood up, and I have the actual quote, and shouted, and Cage would have just remained absolutely calm and kept reading. John, I dearly love you, but I can't bear another minute, and stormed out of the room, which is just wonderful. That section is so very repetitive, and it's also the most meta of this
Yeah,
meta work, where he keeps
right.
saying, we are now in the first part of the fourth section. We're now in the second part of the fourth section. We're now in the third part. And it seems, I have to say, the more I hear it and have read through it, it's my favorite part. I actually quite love it. But because he keeps saying, now we are getting nowhere, and that is a pleasure. For most people hearing it is not a pleasure. It is, it seems endless, but it's more and more delightful as we kind of understand that it's an invitation to not worry about what he's saying. It's just to be there, right?
Right, right, right. I mean, he says, I mean, and he does make a nod that, like, well, if you're annoyed, then it's not a pleasure, but then maybe it'll become a pleasure.
Right.
But it's the same thing. So there's 7 repetitions of this two, this thing of it's like the units divided in half, and it repeats things 7 times. Of here we are, we're in the middle of the third part of the fourth section, and it's clear I'm not going anywhere. We're not getting anywhere, and I'm just sort of going on and on. I mean, I'm just paraphrasing, right?
And
Sort of going
the
on and
funny
on, and
quote. Yeah.
it's a pleasure or it's not a pleasure, and he ends this with the cadence of if anybody is sleepy, let him go to sleep, right?
Right.
That's where
Which
you.
is why my little joke, why we're performing extended lullaby. My hope this Saturday, by the way, for those who are not near Bard, it will be live broadcast on Wave Farm Radio, locally 90.7, but wavefarm.org. You can hear us live do this. There'll be news, and then at 1:03 on the dot, we will begin, hopefully. And Extended Lullaby will begin about halfway through the whole lecture. So if it all works out, my hope is that everyone falls asleep, that the entire audience is put to sleep. I feel like that will be, a triumph.
Yeah.
But it should be quite wonderful. And the exhibit's fantastic.
Yeah.
But back to the section, I think you agree, we chatted a bit beforehand that I think he was very much still under the spell, not so much later in life, but of Gertrude Stein.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And that the beauty of repetition, the idea there's no such thing as repetition, like there's no
Right.
such thing as
Right.
silence, and that each repetition, and these, except for changing first section, first part, second part, third part, they're identical.
Yes.
They're identical, not even where they fall on the beats. It's seven times identical. And yet, as Stein tells us, each repetition is something new. You know, you can never stand in the same river twice.
Right, right. And even he acknowledges it there where he says, like, well, it may be not a pleasure, you may be annoyed now, but as it goes on, and he tells that story in Indeterminacy, right? If you listen to something for 2 minutes and it's boring, then listen to it for 4 and 8 and so on. All right. It's the same phenomenon.
Yeah, exactly. And then following, it's right after this, right, that we have pretty much a full 2 minutes of silence,
There's a great big silence. Yeah. Yeah. The
which is
beginning of the last section is all silent, right?
which is something. And it ends with very funny. I don't know if it's really meant to be funny, but it delights me. After the 2 minutes of silence is a very long time. It's, the middle movement of 4-3-3, I suppose, but it's one thing as a performer to be facing a piano and to do nothing for 2 minutes, to be facing an audience and hold attention, to not have people think it's over for 2 minutes. It's hard. It's very, very hard. But then after that long part, he then says, "Now that's over with," I think.
Yeah. Yeah. He says, that is finished now. It was a pleasure.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm
Yeah.
sure most people think like, if you think that's a pleasure, man, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
But it really is a pleasure if
Yeah,
you just get into it.
it is. And I want to say that this is another thing that's a parallel to the string quartet. So the third movement of the string quartet, the title on it is Nearly Stationary. So it's very slow. It goes by very slowly, and it's all of these mirror canon things, so that you're kind of going around in 8 circles, and it has that exact same aimless, we're going nowhere, disorienting feel that the lecture on nothing has. And I don't know if we want to take a couple of minutes to play that excerpt or
Yeah,
not.
why don't we hear that excerpt?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's the musical equivalent of this part of the lecture.
Wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. That to me is the soundtrack for that section of the
I agree. I love that Gwen Daly put it's full of paradoxes. So here, this is such a great example of the music here and that section of the lecture on nothing, because music, of course, can only exist in time, and yet we're representing stasis. So
Mhm.
how are we present or static while in fact the river's flowing, right? We're
Right.
still moving forward, and that's perhaps why these repetitions are not the same thing over and over again, even though they are the same thing over and over again.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So,
So maybe talk, let's back up a little bit because you've written a good bit about Cage and Zen,
mhm.
and we tend to equate Cage with DT Suzuki. And it's possible that he had already become acquainted with Suzuki, but at this point, he was already reading others on Buddhism. And maybe just talk a bit about his relationship to Buddhism.
Yeah. Yeah. So for sure, uh, I'm sure he would have known Suzuki's writings. I don't know whether he had met him or sat in on the classes or lectures at that time. That's unclear. Certainly, he doesn't name check anybody in the lecture on nothing like he does in some of the later lectures. Um, but we knew he knew Alan Watts, and there's actually an interesting bit of the lecture on nothing. Again, I have to credit Rob Haskins for having dug this one out. There's kind of a steal from Alan Watts in there that shows up. But so he's clearly has read Watts enough to have absorbed some of the language and some of the ideas. But what I've written about and what really I think is one of the under uh, emphasized influences on Cage was R.H. Blythe, Reginald Horace Blythe, who was a British expat living in Japan and Korea, and who was an expert on haiku poetry and wrote extensively on Zen and haiku and poetry in general. One of his books is Zen in English Literature, which Cage mentions once. But the books that for sure I know he was reading at this time was the first volume of his 4 volume book on haiku. It's mostly translations of poetry. The first volume is a general introduction to haiku and to Zen as it relates to that. And Blythe's we know that Cage read this. He quotes from him in some letters, and and he read it around 1950, so it would have been about the time of the lecture. Um, and the thing that Blythe contributes that I think is just so important for Cage is his description of haiku as being about the poetry of things. He says that uh, haiku is a poetry in which things speak their own silent and expressive language. So for Blythe, the subject of the poem in a haiku poem, whether it's the cherry blossoms or it's the, whatever or the frog that's jumping into the pond, whatever that subject is, those things are expressive in themselves, in our experience of them. And the poet, actually, the work of the poet is to not overlay it with a lot of ideas or feelings or any of this self-consciousness. I cribbed a couple of quotes from Blythe because he's just so quotable. He says, haiku is an expression of the joy of our reunion with things. It's our joy of our reunion with things from which we have been parted by self-consciousness. And boy, that's just like, right, that's what the lecture on nothing is all about, right? About how sounds can be worn out by thinking about them is the way that Cage expresses it. But I think there's no doubt that he's reading Blythe and getting a lot of that same idea. Even the statement of where Cage says, I have nothing to say, and I am saying it, and that's poetry as I need it. Blythe says this thing that to me is tantalizingly close to that. He says haiku is the result of the wish, the effort not to speak, not to write poetry, right? He says not to obscure further the truth and suchness of a thing with words, thoughts, and feelings. But yeah, he's saying like, no, the haiku poet is not supposed to say anything, right? And I think Cage really connects with that. Blythe is, and that's his entree to Zen, because what Blythe is doing, he's describing not Zen from a philosophical point of view in this, this sutra and that sutra, the way that Suzuki did. He's saying this is how haiku poets like Basho wrote their poetry. Here's what they went through to do it, to get themselves out of it, to disappear and let the things speak for themselves. And it's a short step then for Cage to say, oh, yeah, I just want sounds to be themselves.
Exactly, exactly. And that is, and it's still, it's not esoteric, but a core aspect of Japanese language and culture is that all things, whether it's a hamburger or a rock, have animus, that they all exude beingness. And
Mhm.
I don't know if Cage read Heidegger, but it is about these things being, or Hegel, in and of themselves. They
Mhm.
just exude thingness.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's not about trying to explain them or describe them. It's finding ways to let them be, right?
right, right. And to let the continuity happen that arises and all these things that are in Lecture on Nothing uh, really fit very well with what he would have been reading in Blythe. And so in that sense, this lecture has a big influence from Zen through Blythe's description of how haiku works. And it's interesting at this time, there's right at the exact same time as the lecture on nothing, he starts trying to write these pieces that he calls haiku. They're never finished. They're just a couple of sketches with the title haiku that never got done. Peters has published them, which I think is a mistake, but I won't get into that either. But uh, clearly he's got this connection to haiku in his mind and to what Blythe
And
says about it.
it's funny. I have to say, when I read your essay of the influence of haiku, I thought it was sort of a revelation because it's common knowledge that D.T. Suzuki,
Yeah,
Zen unto Cage, and to know that so much of this came from not just reading about Buddhism, but really reading about haiku. Cage, in fact, talks about haiku throughout his life.
yeah,
And in this way, there's a famous little talk about the haiku. I forget the original, but mushroom doesn't know that
yeah,
leaf
yeah.
needs to
Leaf is
it.
sticking. Yeah, right, right,
The
right.
idea that a mushroom would know something and that a leaf would feel something or
Yeah,
know
yeah,
something, that's very Zen, but it really comes from haiku. And of course, you can maybe even see in back of me that's a score that becomes the piece Renga, which is a Japanese poetic form that's an extension of haiku, we could say, series of them.
yeah.
That he has many works that pull from this.
And in lecture, coming back to lecture on nothing, just that he describes what he's doing, he uses the word poetry, right? This is, I have nothing to say and I'm saying it, and this is poetry as I need it. And he uses the word poetry elsewhere. And that's not a word he ever uses in the earlier writings. So I think that's also a tip off that this is coming in part from his immersion in Blythe's writings.
I think that phrase is often skipped over.
Mhm.
People quote the first two phrases of that sentence, and that is poetry as I need it. I have to say, as someone who used to be in charge of John Ashbery's legacy, I love that that phrase can be read in multiple ways. And Cage reads it so beautifully,
Mhm.
non-inflected. Is it poetry as I need it, or is it poetry as one needs it?
Right.
Poetry as I need it, as opposed to the times I don't need it. There's many ways to interpret that little phrase, but it does suggest that this lecture is a poetics.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's really interesting to read it compared to that Black Mountain lecture, which is all about music and Beethoven and Satie and has music analyses in it and all that. And it's very polemical that Beethoven was wrong and Satie was right. And that's the other person who's sort of behind Lecture on Nothing is Satie as well, right? I think that's and Satie and Gertrude Stein kind of connect via Virgil Thompson. So you could definitely connect all those people together. Um, but uh, comparing that earlier and earlier meaning 2 years earlier at Black Mountain with this one, I feel like it's that same. He's the content is the same about this is what musical structure is, this is what musical form is, continuity, this is what materials, this is method, but it's gotten mashed up with the whole Zen point of view about poetry that Blythe brings to it, and you get this new language, this new way of speaking about it that's much softer. It's still provocative. I mean, he definitely was pissing people off, and I think that's part of the intention. I think he's very well aware of it.
Oh, I'm sure he knew that fourth section would drive
Yeah.
people nuts.
Well, there's that thing, and we don't have to share, but the that line after right afterwards where he says, "Oh, read me the part again where I disinherit everybody." And
Right.
I recently found out that that's actually the caption to a New Yorker cartoon,
Yes. Yeah, I wanted to bring it up.
1940,
Yeah.
that shows a curmudgeonly old man with his lawyer reading the will, and he says, "Now read me that part where I disinherit everybody," again with a big smile on his face. And I think that's John kind of saying,
Yeah.
yeah, that's the part where where I basically
Yeah.
alienated everybody.
But also, it's always that we need the glass and we need the milk. So it's
Yeah,
both that funny joke, and maybe everyone there would have just read the New Yorker, but and know the cartoon. But it's also that you don't need me to tell you this. I don't need to explain this. It just is it.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
and and I also love that similar back to paradoxes near the beginning. There's the pusher and the pushed,
Right, right.
right?
Yeah, you
In
need
the
both of it.
conversation. But you
Right,
need both. So
you
we
both.
need sound and silence. We need structure and something in the structure. And that some of what I'm saying maybe isn't important. It's my way of expressing a structure to you. And yet it also is important.
Yeah, yeah,
And you can ignore the structure and just listen to the sentences.
yeah.
He gets to do both, which
Right.
is something
Yeah,
in this lecture on nothing.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Which has no ideas in it, he says. Right. So,
Right, right.
yeah, yeah. Totally disingenuous, that one.
And then suddenly we have Kansas, Texas coming in.
Yeah,
Um, the very delightful, again, oft quoted lines near the end about meeting someone from Texas who says that nobody sings in Texas, and then he explains why.
yeah. Because we have no music in Texas, right? Um, yeah, and his whole thing against recordings, which had been something that he had been on that warpath since the late 40s of that it's not a thing. It, music is a means of transporting yourself, right? Of forgetting yourself. And so that's his objection to thinking you can own it as a record,
Yeah.
right?
And also the idea that you can't own, he says explicitly near the beginning, we can't own the past. We can't
Mhm.
possess the past. And I think that is, again, that's an idea. We can only be really now.
Right.
And if we're thinking about tomorrow or we're trying to possess the past, we're on the wrong path. We can
Right.
only be, right here, right now. Um, it really is overall this exceptional poetics of Buddhist thinking, or Zen thinking in many ways, a poetics
Yeah.
of nothing, let's say, or no
Yeah.
mind,
And and never to lose sight also of the fact that it's just beautifully written.
really. Yeah.
That's
And yet
it's
we're stuck having to fill certain structures through repeating something 7 times or waiting a long time till the next structure
yeah,
begins. And there's great beauty in that because that is how music works.
yeah,
Not
yeah.
that has to do things, but that one creates a structure and more or less sticks to it. And
Yeah,
that
but
beauty.
but then there's also all of those beautiful images of the wheat field. Is it corn or is it wheat? He doesn't know
Right,
because
right.
he's from New York. But the and the glass and the milk and there's all these very concrete
Beautiful.
images, which again I think comes from having read all of that haiku stuff
Mm.
in
And I
Blythe.
really assumed, I don't know what you think, that there's a funny little story toward a little further into the lecture about the man on people
Oh
hiking.
yeah, on the hill and what's he waiting for?
And it's
Yeah,
like
I
kind
don't
of
know where that came
Cage's,
from.
I thought it was Cage's attempt at a Zen story.
Yeah, it
Because it is
sounded
like
like
those monk stories.
yeah, but he hadn't gotten in touch with Suzuki yet and gotten this endless store of great Zen stories that he then comes up with. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have all these people saying, well, is this why you're walking? Have you lost your dog? Is this why you're climbing? And at the end, the punchline, if we want to call it that, is I'm just here.
Yeah, I'm just standing.
I'm
Right.
just
Yeah.
standing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not
Why are
standing
you
here for all
standing there?
the
Yeah.
reason. Right. Right.
It's
Yeah.
so
Which
funny.
again, considering that audience of New York 1950 prominent artist probably, was making a statement for sure, right?
One of the
Similarly,
most
we didn't talk about the questions at the end where Cage actually
thank you. Yes.
created,
Yeah.
where he wrote the answers to, there was always a Q&A period after these talks, and he wrote the answers before the lecture was delivered. And so whatever the questions were, they got the same answers, which
Yeah.
was, I'm sure, quite aggravating. But if those lectures were anything like, university colloquia that I've been to, the Q&A period is probably the worst for ego posturing. So this was a great way to just like pull the rug out from under that.
And have it, as people probably started to figure out that they were prepared answers, have it end.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
I'm sure it
exactly.
would have been torture for him to have to explain something, the point of which is to not explain in some
Yeah,
way. Because you're
yeah,
maybe read a couple if you got them, they're so funny.
yeah. Well, I was just going to say the last one is the one that ended it, which is I have no more answers.
There we go.
So,
And I'll say with that, that we have no more answers. And of course, this is what leads to a famous Cage quote, all answers are answers to all questions,
mhm.
which is demonstrated there, that we have much more that we could say, but we
Oh,
won't be saying it because we've come to the end of our hour. So I hope everyone will listen in or attend on Saturday at 1 p.m. if you can for our group immersive performance of Lecture on Nothing. If nothing else, though, I hope you'll run to your copy of Silence, and if you don't have one, you need to, and read the lecture, but read it aloud. I think it's really important to read it aloud, absolutely essential. If you just read it, you're just reading it to try to get meanings that many of which are can only be experienced through the structure, let's say. So with that, James, thank you so much for joining us today.
oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
And thank all of you for being here. Please join us in about a month. We'll put out an announcement soon. We will have folks from Halberstadt, from the Cage Organ Project, who will be talking about the 639-year-long cage organ work that's being performed there. The next pitch change is August 5th. If you happen to be in Halberstadt then, I'll be performing Lecture on Nothing on the 3rd. So please come and cheer me on, but not during the silent part. Cheer me on at the end or beforehand. So thank you all for being here, and I hope to see you again in a month, if not this Saturday. Thank you all. Bye bye.
Thanks, Jeffrey.